Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for having me.
To get us started, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of Sweden and Sweden's NATO and military non-alignment policy. So, after the Cold War ended, Sweden did not end up joining NATO and they pursued a policy of neutrality. And after joining the EU in 1995, they still remained militarily non-aligned. So, first, I'd like to ask you, Ambassador, why did Sweden decide to pursue neutrality and then military non-alignment?
Well, it actually goes back much longer in history. Sweden was one of the big powers of Europe. And I once read that between the year 1000 and 1814, which is when we declared ourselves military non-aligned and neutral, we were in about 60 wars. So we were one of the great warrior nations of Europe. So in 1814 or 1809, actually, we lost Finland to Russia. We still had Norway in a union. We were in a union with Norway, but Sweden was kind of the leading country. And we had parts of where St. Petersburg is today, that used to be ours, parts of Germany, and so on. So we were a power, really big power to reckon with. But all those wars had actually made us extremely poor, and we also had to get a new king, because the former king and that royal family was kind of ousted. Long story. Anyway, we get a new king. We decide to import a general from Napoleon's army, thinking that it's good to be allied to with Napoleon. This marshal, his name is Bernadotte, comes to Stockholm, realizes that the country is extremely poor. He cannot expand the territories. There's no money for it. So he decides he wants to be a kind of peace negotiator in Europe. And to do that with credibility, he declared Sweden neutral. So he would be seen as a neutral kind of person in that. And also he turned on Napoleon, so it didn't work out that well. Anyway, he, first king in the family of our royal family today, the Bernadottes. Anyway, so then you have extreme poverty, people feeling, 1850s, 1860s, religious persecution, hierarchical society. 1/4 of our population leaves for the United States. And then when First World War comes, we're still deciding to be neutral, to keep our country outside the war. Same goes then for the Second World War. When the Second World War ends, Finland had fought so bravely against the Soviet Union at the time, and was still not gobbled up. They were not, occupied by the Soviet Union, but Finland had to sign a kind of friendship pact with the Soviet Union after the war. We proposed to Denmark and Norway that we should create a Nordic Defense Union. But when NATO was formed and the United States decided to join the Europeans on transatlantic defense and security policy, the Danes and Norwegians felt that was where they belonged, because they were occupied by the Germans during the war. So that left us, and we decided then, because the closeness to Finland was part of Sweden for 700 years. We lost them in 1809, as I said. Our security is extremely well tied together. And if we would have joined the alliance at the time, the politicians then were really worried that the Soviet Union would make Finland part of the Soviet Union and that it wouldn't be an independent country anymore. There were other factors playing into this as well, but this is one of the most important ones. So then, to make our militarily non-alignedness, we were not neutral. We were militarily non-aligned to be neutral in case of war. It's the fine levels, same but different. Anyway, so to make this credible, our militarily non-alignedness, because we had the Warsaw Pact on one side and NATO on the other, we developed a very strong defense industry. So, we build our own fighter jets to this day. We build our own submarines. We have lots of weapons that we export to the United States and so on. We had a huge conscript army. We spent about 4% of GDP on defense up till the mid-80s. And that's when, the Soviet Union started crumbling. And then when it fell in 1991, I remember very vividly, I was a student in Moscow at the time. We all thought it was a bright new day, a new Russia, peace in Europe. We had peace in Europe because of, the structures that we have created, the European Union and NATO, but peace in Russia, with Russia, new Russia. So we started dismantling our military, not completely, but went down to basically 1% at the end of the 90s. And then we realized things are not going that well with our neighbor. So gradually and slowly, and then we saw the attack on Georgia in 2008, and Crimea, of course, in 2014. So we have increased our defense spending lots in this time. Actually, between 2014 and 2025, we had decided to increase our defense spending by 80%. And now, even before we decided to join NATO, we had taken a decision to go up to 2% because it's just too much tensions in our region. So that's basically the history of it. So, for Sweden to take a decision to join NATO and, change footing in 3 months after almost the same kind of military and security policy since 1814, it's a huge step. That's an answer to your question.
Yeah, and Ambassador, that's a perfect segue to the next question I had, which is, given that huge step, could you tell us exactly what about the invasion of Ukraine made it so that they would apply for NATO because of that? Why apply now?
Well, as our Prime Minister said, that the attack on this brutal, unprovoked attack on a sovereign country in Europe in February changed everything. Because we saw and we realized what the Russians could do. We had seen the writing on the wall, of course, but I think most of us didn't want to believe that it would actually happen. We haven't had, of course, we had the war in the Balkans, but we hadn't had a war with such a power as Russia, and a nuclear power. I mean, not a nuclear weapon power since the Second World War. So this really, made us rethink our own security situation, and we have already have a very, very close relationship to NATO. We have an enhanced partnership. We were as close as you could be without being a NATO ally. Then when the debate started in Finland that this was something they were considering, we started considering the same. And as I told you, throughout history, our security has been tied to the security of Finland. So that really made the politicians in Sweden and the population in Sweden think that maybe this is the time we really need to, be part of an alliance. Both that people can trust that we will come to others' rescue, but that we also get security assurances. So, this is it's not just us wanting security assurances, which is really important, but we also want to show our neighbors that they can really, we've had a solidarity declaration for many years saying that we will come to the rescue of our neighbors if war or crisis would happen. But of course, that's not as cut in stone as actually joining the alliance.
And for our listeners who might not know as much about the NATO structure and what it entails, given, especially as you said, that Sweden has worked quite closely with NATO in the past, I know the security assurance is a big deal for Sweden in what it gains from joining as a full member, but maybe could you talk also about how does adding Sweden to NATO exactly enhance NATO's capabilities, maybe especially in the Baltic region?
Yeah. Well, now I wish I had a map. I have a small map here on the backside of my paper, and if you see here the Baltic Sea, and you realize how big Sweden is, and you have Finland. So if we're concerned about the security of the Baltic states, which maybe are the ones who are most vulnerable in our region, if you add this territory and you add that, and that's Norway I'm pointing to now, that's Finland. If you have Finland, you get because when we join NATO, you can start do the planning for the whole region. Right now, you cannot plan same as deep military planning. But now you can add our territories to that planning, and you can add our military capabilities to that planning. So it really increases the security of the whole region. And as the Senate yesterday voted here in the US on the ratification of Sweden and Finland's membership, one senator said that if you look at the map now, and you have St. Petersburg at the end of the Finnish Gulf, of the bay. Now it's 2 NATO countries surrounding that bay, Finland on top and then Estonia. Then you have the outlet of the Baltic, which is where Denmark is, where Denmark and Sweden basically meets. It's only like, 3 kilometers, 1.5 miles, 2 miles wide. at the where it's at its narrowest. Now there will be two NATO countries surrounding that strait. So of course this really increases the security in the Baltic. The Baltic basically becomes a NATO sea if you take away Kaliningrad and then of course Russia there at the end of the Finnish Bay. So this is giving us much more, capabilities, and we tell everyone that we are a net contributor to security. We have a very modern, capable armed forces, latest technology, very well trained, and we have decided, as I said, to go up to 2%, so that we will increase our capabilities even further. Finland has a very strong military force, one of the biggest, I think, conscript armies in the world, if you look at it per capita. And they have just bought F-35s, the fighter jet, U.S. fighter jets. They bought 65 of them. We have our own fighter jets. We will be up to 90 fighter jets very soon. That sounds like small numbers, but actually, I heard yesterday, if you count Finland and the U.S. per capita, the U.S. would have to increase its amount of fighter jets by tenfold, I think, to come to the same. I mean, it's an enormous capability. So this, what we do together, and then you have Norway with their F-35s, and our joint capabilities are very, very strong. So it's really a net contribution to security.
Right, and now I want to sort of pivot to Russia-Sweden relations. And so Russia has issued threats in response to the possibility of Sweden joining NATO, saying that they have no issue with them joining, but if military infrastructure were deployed, they would restore military balance. So what's your take on how joining NATO may affect Russia-Sweden relations, and
Mm.
especially during this interim period where all NATO countries must ratify Sweden's application, like you said, the Senate ratified yesterday.
Yeah,
Are
we're
there
actually up.
concerns?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Are there concerns from Sweden about increased vulnerability during this time?
Yes, of course we have been concerned, but we have gotten, so not full security assurances, but very strong assurances from all the countries surrounding us that in the meantime, they will basically see us as an ally, even if we are not. So that's, of course, we're very, very happy for that support. We haven't seen any military threats coming from Russia to our territory on these times. Of course, they are preoccupied by the horrendous war in the Ukraine. But we have to be prepared for everything, because this is a country where, President Putin has done what he said he would do. So nowadays we have to really read what he says differently. And also, it is a country with nuclear weapons. So we have enhanced our own security during this time. We were doing that even before we, decided to join NATO. So we have increased our presence on the island of Gotland, which is one of the most strategic places in the Baltic Sea. And we have also, increased our security otherwise. We have also been looking out for cyber and hybrid threats and disinformation threats. Haven't seen that much, actually. So this is to better be safe than sorry kind of policy.
And Sweden, Finland, and Turkey have recently signed an accord to lift Turkey's veto on Sweden and Finland's NATO membership in exchange for promises on strengthening counterterrorism efforts. So I was wondering, what specifically did Sweden pledge, and is there concern that Turkey may reinstate their veto?
Of course, we hope they won't, because we will contribute to the full all security of all members of the alliance. And as I said, us joining really increases the security in the north. And we have said publicly that us joining is, we of course see all of the NATO territory, if your territory, as our responsibility as well. So we are really a country to be counted on. So in the discussions with Turkey, we discussed lifting a weapon embargo that we've had on Turkey. That comes into play when Turkey would like to buy something, military, sales from Sweden. There's been talk about. Now let's see, my mind slips me. Also, the contacts we will have with the Kurdish-related organizations in northern Syria. YPG and SDG. We have never financed those organizations like the United States is, for instance, financing those. We haven't done that. But we will look over the way we have contacts with those organizations. There's also been a discussion on extradition of people that are, related to terrorist activities or other criminal activities. So that's also a discussion that's ongoing. But that's a judicial process in Sweden, just like everywhere else. So that's not something that the government can take a decision on. It's a police matter and it's a judicial and legal process. But that's also a discussion we are having with Turkey. So we are happy that we could come, and we also have a new terrorism legislation came into force 1st of July, where it now is forbidden to be a member of a terrorist organization. You can still express support for a terrorist organization, just like here, it's through freedom of speech, but you can't be a member of one, among other things. So we have had a good dialogue with our Turkish friends, and we hope that they will, when it's time for them to ratify in their parliament, that they will, support and ratify it swiftly so we can become members as soon as possible.
And Ambassador, I wanted to draw our listeners' attention first on how the U.S. Senate recently ratified the Sweden and Finland's NATO accession.
Mm-hmm.
And to start us off on this topic, I know for our listeners who are interested in pursuing a role in diplomacy or going into that career, I wanted to ask you, what was that like on the Senate floor when that happened? And specifically, Ambassador, what was your role? How did you make this happen?
Well, of course, it's not my doing in a sense. I hope I have been contributing to this happening. I have actually, over the last few months, I've met 50 out of 100 senators and had in-depth conversations with them. And I have given everyone this paper. Sweden in NATO, a net contributor to Europe's security, where we lay out like the basic facts. And also trying, to, if they had any questions marks, to try to iron them out and so on. So it's been a big effort from the embassy here in Sweden to reach out to the members of the Senate. And then also we have been part of a lot of media interviews, trying to raise. And there has been lots of interest from the media in the US and globally, of course, but my responsibility is media here. Our prime minister was here to meet President Biden a couple of months ago, together with the Finnish president. Our foreign minister has been here. Our minister of defense has been here, and there has been congressional and Senate delegations coming to Sweden, and also military visits. So head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley, was in Sweden in June. So very, big exchange. So our role here at the embassy has really been to, enlighten members of the Senate, to explain to them, but we have had huge support. So I think they would have voted for us, most of them anyway, but on the margin, I hope it would have helped, and at least they are much more knowledgeable. And yesterday at the Senate floor, 18 senators spoke, and they were really, I could recognize some of the language we had used in our talks. So they had, but really, they all confirmed, the contribution of Sweden and Finland as net contributors, that this will make the Baltic more secure. We come in as two strong democracies with strong economies, and so on. So it was really moving to sit there on the balcony together with my Swedish colleagues here from the embassy and also our Finnish colleagues, and listen to that. Then there was one senator who voted no, and he explained his thinking around this. And then quite a few senators came up to the balcony where we were sitting just to congratulate us, and so it was a very, very moving day. And yes, that the support is so strong and so heartfelt is really fantastic, and I think it sends a very strong signal to the Kremlin. That this is something, the enlargement is something that the United States, who is of course the most important member maybe of NATO, or at least the biggest member of NATO, is fully behind. There are no question marks on that. And also to the other members of NATO, that they can rest assured that this is something that the United States is really supporting.
Right. And
It was a
Ambassador,
fantastic day, I can tell you.
congratulations. Ambassador, I know you've probably heard this question several times, but I know I wanted to address a concern that I've heard some congressmen and some Americans say, which is that maybe because China is America's biggest adversary, maybe the US shouldn't expand its security commitments in Europe because doing so may make the US less safe.
Mm.
How would you respond to
Well,
those who have that concern?
exactly as I said before, Sweden is a real net contributor to security. And again, if you look at the map, if you don't have Sweden and Finland in NATO, it's actually more difficult to defend the Baltic republics. So the pressure, I mean, of course, if you join an alliance and you all sign up to, the commitments, that means everyone, including the United States. But given that we join and with our capabilities and the possibility, as I said, to plan around the Baltic, it actually lets the US off the hook a bit, if I may say. So it doesn't mean that we don't count on US presence, but it, of course, makes it easier to defend the Baltic. So I would actually say it's the contrary. With us joining, the US can, of course, continue to be engaged in Europe, but we also understand the focus on China. We are all worried about the developments, in China and the tensions and so on. And also, if we go north over the Arctic, if you have then Canada, the United States, the UK, Iceland, Finland, Norway, and Sweden in NATO all together, and you have Chinese aspirations up there, it's actually strengthening also the security in the north of the globe. So actually, I think it's the contrary.
And
I hope
lastly,
you think so too now that I have explained it.
of course, yes, definitely convincing. Yeah. So, sort of looking towards the long term, what, if any, implications do you think Swedish NATO membership will have on the war in Ukraine, or perhaps European security in the long term?
Well, as I said, with this enlargement, you really bring two very capable nations into the security planning process of NATO, and I think that is very important. It sends a strong signal to the Kremlin that we take our security very seriously, and we have all supported Ukraine as much as we can with weapons and everything military related. But countries like Sweden, we have also really supported the Ukrainian population with money. So we have, put funds straight into their central bank to use for the administration, for if they don't get help with that, the pension system collapses. And then you could envisage that people feel like older people. I mean, you never know if they would, feel that it's better to get a pension from Russia. You never know. So it's important that we help the Ukrainians as much as we can, not only militarily, but also with other resources, because it's a very frail society right now fighting for their life. And they are really fighting our war. Because imagine if we all would be, if we would have a real war with a big part of Western Europe and Russia, then we're talking about something completely different. So, in a way, the Ukrainians are fighting the war for us. And that's very important to remember and give them as much support as we can. And of course, we have the winter coming up. Energy prices in Europe will be very high, and we are talking about rationing energy consumption and so on. So, it will be a tough winter, most likely. But it's important that we all think about why we have pull our weight or do what we can in the end to help the Ukrainians win the war.
Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. It was a great conversation.
No, thank you. You should all become diplomats. It's a great job.